The morning the debt collectors came, they did not knock. They banged. 6 men in black jackets stood at the gate of the Lekki mansion I once called home, waving papers with my name on them, my real name, my bank verification number, my signature, on loans I never signed for cars I never drove, for a company I never owned. And the woman screaming at them from the balcony, telling them that there had been a mistake, that she was Mrs. Chukwuemeka now, that this was her house, her husband's house, was the same woman who once smiled at me across my own dining table while sleeping with my husband behind my back. If you are new here, welcome, because by the time this story ends, you will understand exactly how a woman who thought she had won everything ended up owing millions of naira she never borrowed, and you will not believe how it happened. This is not a story about a mistress simply getting what she deserves. It is stranger than that and darker, because the man who built this entire trap was clever enough to make sure he would never be the one standing at that gate when the collectors came. Subscribe now, because you do not want to miss how this unravels. And trust me, it unravels slowly, then all at once. My name is Adaeze. Before all of this, I was simply Mrs. Chukwuemeka, wife to Emeka, a man Lagos society called a self-made success story. We met at a wedding in Enugu 11 years ago, when I was 24 and foolish enough to believe that a man who complimented your gele was a man who noticed details, who paid attention, who would be careful with your heart. Emeka was tall, smooth-talking, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice, the kind of man other men deferred to instinctively without quite knowing why, and the kind of man women noticed the moment he walked through a door, myself included, though I would never have admitted it that easily at the time. He wore a well-tailored agbada that evening, navy blue with gold embroidery, and he had a way of listening when you spoke that made you feel, even in a crowded reception hall, like the only person in the room worth his attention. He told me that night that he had just started a logistics company, moving goods between Lagos and Onitsha, and that in 5 years he would own trucks, warehouses, an empire, describing his ambitions with such vivid, confident detail that I could almost see the warehouses already standing, could almost hear the trucks rumbling down the expressway toward a future that felt in that moment entirely inevitable. I laughed. 3 years later, I stood beside him at our own wedding in a hall he had rented in Victoria Island, and I believed the empire had already begun. Those 3 years of courtship were, looking back now with the clarity that only ruin can give you, full of small warnings I chose to read as romance instead of red flags. Emeka proposed to me in front of 40 guests at a restaurant in Ikeja, a grand gesture that cost more than my mother's entire monthly pension. And I remember thinking, even then, a small flicker of a thought I quickly buried, that a man who had only just started his company should not be spending that kind of money on a single evening. My father, a retired civil servant who believed strongly in modest living, pulled me aside that same night and asked me quietly whether I had seen Emeka's account books, whether I understood exactly how a man builds wealth that fast, that young. I laughed it off. I told him love does not need account books. I was 26 and certain that my father simply did not understand ambition the way my generation did. I think about that conversation often now, how easily I dismissed a question that, if I had actually taken it seriously, might have changed the entire shape of my life. For a while, it looked real. We moved from a rented flat in Surulere to a duplex in Lekki Phase 1. He bought me a Toyota Camry, then upgraded it to a Lexus 2 years later. He hired a driver, a cook, and eventually a gateman named Sunday, who called me Madame with such respect that I almost forgot the girl from Enugu who used to trek to school because her family could not afford Okada fare every day. I told myself I had made it. I told my mother on the phone, in a voice thick with pride, that her daughter had married well. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that every single thing in that house, the cars, the marble floors, the chandeliers that dripped like frozen rain from the ceiling, was built on paper. Loans. Loans stacked on loans, hidden behind smiles, an expensive perfume, and a business that on the surface looked like it was thriving. In the early years, I was too busy enjoying the life to question its foundations. I hosted dinner parties for Emeka's business associates, women who admired my furniture and asked which interior decorator I used, men who shook Emeka's hand with the exaggerated warmth reserved for people you hope to borrow something from eventually. I joined a women's fellowship at our church in Lekki, the kind where the offering basket circulated among wives who wore designer wrappers and compared the schools their children attended, though Emeka and I had no children of our own yet, a private sorrow we rarely discussed openly. One more thing I told myself we would address once business had settled into a steadier rhythm. I remember sitting through those fellowship meetings, smiling politely, while other women described their children's milestones, feeling a familiar ache I never fully voiced even to Emeka, who tended to change the subject quickly whenever I raised it, always promising we would see a specialist soon, always finding a reason that soon kept becoming later. I understand now, with the particular clarity hindsight provides, that a man already drowning quietly in debt may not have had the emotional or financial bandwidth to properly confront a conversation about fertility treatments and their considerable cost, though he never once framed his avoidance that honestly to me at the time. Looking back, I wonder now whether that steadier rhythm was always a mirage he kept promising, a horizon that moved every time we got close enough to touch it. There were moments, small and easy to dismiss individually, that should have told me something was wrong, long before Chichi ever entered the picture. Emeka would occasionally ask me to transfer money from my own personal savings account into his business account, always with an explanation, always with a promise to return it within the week, and always eventually returning it, though sometimes weeks later than promised. He grew irritable when I asked to see the company's financial statements, waving me off with the same phrase every time. "This is not something you need to worry your head over, Ada." I remember once finding an unfamiliar name on a bank alert on his phone, a debit of 2 million naira to an account I did not recognize. And when I asked about it, he told me it was a supplier payment for the Onitsha route, said so quickly and so smoothly that I didn't think to ask a follow-up question until much later, lying awake at night, replaying the conversation and noticing how rehearsed his voice sounded. The cracks started small, the way cracks always do. Emeka began taking calls in the bathroom, the shower running as aspirating noise while his voice dropped low. He started traveling more, Abuja one week, Port Harcourt the next, always for meetings he never discussed afterwards. I asked questions the way a wife asks questions when she's trying to not sound suspicious, gently, sideways, hoping the answer will simply appear on its own. He always had an answer ready, smooth as everything else about him. Business is business, Ada. Don't worry your head over things you don't understand. I let it go. I let it go because I loved him, and because loving him had become, somewhere along the line, the same thing as trusting him blindly. It was at a christening in Ikeja that I first saw her properly, Chamaka. Everyone called her Chichi, a name that sounded playful, harmless, like something you would call a kitten. She was younger than me, 29 to my 35, with the kind of confidence that made older women in the room straighten their backs when she walked past. She wore a fitted Ankara gown that afternoon, her hair styled in the kind of effortless-looking updo that actually takes a stylist 3 hours to achieve. And she moved through the reception hall, greeting people by name, remembering small details about their lives that made everyone feel, briefly, like the most important person in the room. I remember thinking in that first uncomplicated glance that she seemed like exactly the kind of woman I might have wanted to befriend, warm and quick-witted and generous with her compliments. She worked, she told me that day, as an event planner, and she had apparently planned 2 of Emeka's recent corporate dinners, the ones he had described to me only briefly, in the vague, distracted way he had begun describing most of his business activities by then. She spoke about her business with genuine pride, telling me about a wedding she had coordinated in Banana Island the month before, describing the floral arrangements and the lighting design with such detailed enthusiasm that I found myself that first day genuinely charmed by her. I even considered briefly hiring her for an anniversary dinner I had been planning to surprise Emeka with later that year, a dinner that, in the end, I never got to host.
I remember shaking her hand and thinking nothing of it. I remember Emeka's eyes flicking toward her for half a second longer than necessary. And I remember telling myself I was imagining things, because what wife wants to admit that she noticed her husband's eyes move first? I remember too a small comment my friend Ngozi made in the car on our way home that evening. Something offhand about how attentive that event planner had seemed toward Emeka throughout the reception, and how I had brushed the comment aside almost irritably, telling Ngozi she was reading too much into ordinary professional friendliness. I think about that car ride often now, how easily I defended a stranger's behavior toward my own husband simply because admitting suspicion felt more frightening than dismissing it. I was not imagining things. It took 4 months for the whispers to become undeniable. In those 4 months, small things accumulated the way small things always do before a larger truth surfaces. Emeka started guarding his phone more closely, turning the screen away when messages arrived, stepping outside to take calls he used to take freely in front of me. He began working out again after years of neglecting the small home gym we had built in the mansion's boys' quarters, and he started paying more attention to his appearance in a way that felt, in hindsight, less like personal renewal and more like performance for an audience that was no longer me. I think about that car ride often now, how easily I defended a stranger's behavior toward my own husband, simply because admitting suspicion felt more frightening than dismissing it. A friend from church, Ngozi, the kind of friend who tells you things because she loves you and not because she wants to hurt you, showed me a photo one Sunday afternoon after service, her hands trembling slightly as she passed me her phone, clearly dreading my reaction even as she felt obligated to show me. Emeka and Chichi at a rooftop lounge in Victoria Island, his hand resting on the small of her back in a way that husbands do not touch event planners they hired for one dinner, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, close together in a manner that needed no further explanation. Ngozi told me the photo had been circulating quietly among a small group of mutual acquaintances for almost 2 weeks before she finally worked up the courage to show me directly, unable to keep watching me remain unaware while everyone around me apparently already knew. I confronted him that same night. I remember the exact spot in our bedroom where I stood, by the window overlooking the estate's manicured hedges, holding my phone with the photo still open, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I remember rehearsing the words in my head during the entire drive home from Ngozi's house, trying to find a version of the confrontation that would not end in the answer I already, on some level, knew was coming. He did not deny it. That was the part that broke something in me, more than the affair itself. He simply sat on the edge of our bed, rubbed his face with both hands and said, "Ada, I have been under a lot of pressure." As if pressure was an exclamation. As if pressure was a reason a man puts his hand on another woman's back in public, where anyone could see, where someone was always going to see, because Lagos never keeps secrets for long. It only pretends to. I asked him how long. He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me it had been longer than whatever number he eventually gave me. 4 months, he said, though I would later suspect it had been closer to 7. I asked him why, a question I knew even as I asked it was too large and too small at the same time, impossible to answer honestly in a single sentence. He told me Chichi made him feel like a young man again, that she admired him without demanding anything of him, that being around her felt lighter than being around me. I remember standing very still when he said that word, lighter, as though 11 years of building a life together, of managing his household, covering for his absences at family functions, defending him to my own parents when they raised concerns, had somehow become a weight he needed relief from. I asked him if he loved her. He did not answer that one at all. He simply looked at the floor, and in that silence, I understood that whatever this was, it was not going to end with an apology and a fresh start, no matter how badly some small humiliated part of me wanted it to. I did not throw anything. I did not scream, though I understand why women in my position sometimes do. I simply asked him to sleep in the guest room that night, and he did, without argument, which somehow hurt more than if he had fought to stay beside me. I lay awake until almost 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, trying to locate the exact moment our marriage had started dying, and realizing with a cold, sinking certainty that I could not find it because it had not been one moment. It had been years of small neglects I had chosen not to name. I want you to understand something before we go further, because this story is not about a simple case of a man cheating on his wife. That happens every day, in every city, and it is sad, but it is not the reason you are still watching. The reason is what came after. Because Emeka did not fight to keep me. He did not beg, did not cry, did not do any of the things men do in the films when they realize they are about to lose something valuable. Instead, over the following weeks, he grew distant in a way that felt deliberate, almost engineered, as though he was clearing space in his life for someone else to occupy. And I began to wonder quietly, in the parts of my mind I did not say out loud even to Ngozi, whether the affair was not the disease, but only a symptom of something rotting underneath that I had not yet seen. The divorce, when it came, moved faster than I expected. Emeka's lawyer, a sharp young man named Barrister Adaeze, presented papers within 6 weeks, and Emeka himself seemed almost relieved to sign them. He offered me a settlement, a modest sum that felt more like a payoff to disappear quietly than compensation for 11 years of marriage. I remember sitting across from Emeka in Barrister Adesa's office, the two of us signing documents in a silence that felt physical. And I remember one specific clause the lawyer read aloud, almost as a formality, about the removal of my name from certain joint financial obligations tied to Emeka's business. Obligations I had signed years earlier as a supportive young wife without fully understanding what a guarantor agreement meant in practice. Barrister Adaeze assured me and later provided documentation confirming that my name had been formally and completely released from those obligations as part of the settlement, dated and notarized, my BVN cleanly detached from anything belonging to Emeka's company from that day forward. At the time, I barely registered the significance of that clause. I was too tired, too heartbroken, too eager to leave that office and that marriage behind me. I did not know then how much that single piece of paperwork, boring and procedural as it seemed, would end up mattering, or to whom. I packed my things into 3 suitcases, said goodbye to Sunday the gateman who cried more than I did, and moved into a small 2-bedroom flat in Yaba that my sister helped me find. My mother called every day for the first month, not to console me exactly, but to remind me, gently and then less gently, that a woman my age starting over was not the tragedy society made it out to be. I didn't believe her then, I believe her now. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Emeka married Chichi in a private ceremony that made the society pages of 2 Lagos lifestyle blogs. I saw the photos the way everyone eventually sees photos they wish they hadn't, through a mutual friend's WhatsApp status. Chichi in a cream lace gown, standing where I once stood, in front of the same marble staircase I once climbed every night to bed. I will not lie to you and tell you it did not hurt. It hurt in a way that sat in my chest for weeks like a stone I could not swallow or spit out. But I also felt something else underneath the pain, something I could not name yet, a strange, quiet unease, like watching someone walk confidently toward a door they do not know is already broken. Before we continue, if this story has already surprised you even once, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time, because what happens next to Chichi is the part nobody sees coming, even her. For the first few months of her marriage, Chichi's life looked from the outside exactly like mine used to look. She posted photos from Dubai, from a spa retreat in the Seychelles, from the interior of the Lekki mansion which she had redecorated top to bottom, tearing out the furniture I had chosen and replacing it with pieces that looked like they belonged in a magazine, gold accents everywhere, a new dining table imported from Italy that Sunday told me cost more than most people's annual salary. She threw herself a birthday party 6 months into the marriage that made the rounds on 2 different Lagos lifestyle blogs. A lavish affair with a live band, a cake shaped like the Eiffel Tower, and enough champagne, according to Sunday's slightly scandalized retelling, to fill a small swimming pool.
Watching those photos surface on my phone during that period, curated and glossy and utterly convincing, I remember feeling a complicated knot of emotions I did not fully understand at the time. Part of me still ached with the raw humiliation of having been replaced so publicly so soon. But another part of me, quieter and harder to admit, felt a strange kind of relief watching from a distance as someone else now carried the exhausting weight of performing a lifestyle I had once performed myself. The constant need to appear happy, wealthy, chosen, secure, when underneath the surface, nothing about that performance had ever been built on solid ground. She hired a new cook because the old one, Mama Rose, quit within 2 months, telling anyone who would listen that the new madam was impossible to please and paid salaries later and later each month. A detail that, at the time, seemed like nothing more than ordinary domestic friction between a demanding new wife and an old set-in-her-ways cook, loyal to the previous madam. Looking back now, of course, it was the very first thread of the unraveling, the earliest sign that the money keeping that household running had already begun to slow to a worrying trickle, months before anyone outside that house understood why. I heard this from Sunday, who I still spoke to occasionally, because Sunday, God bless him, could not keep a secret to save his life, and because some part of me, a part I was not proud of, wanted to know what was happening in that house. Chi-Chi, from what Sunday told me, and from what I observed on the few occasions our paths crossed at mutual events I could not avoid, threw herself into the role of Mrs. Chukwuemeka with an enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. She repainted the exterior of the mansion, hosted a housewarming party with a live band flown in from Abuja, 3 different caterers competing for a menu she could not quite decide on, and printed invitation cards on gold foil paper that Sunday said cost more than his monthly salary to produce for the 200 guests she eventually settled on, and began posting a new photo online almost every day, each one more curated than the last, her smile in every picture wide enough to suggest she needed the world to see it as proof of something. I recognized that particular kind of performance because I had once performed it myself in the earlier years of my own marriage, before I understood that a smile you have to keep proving is usually a smile hiding a question you are afraid to ask out loud. A lesson I had learned slowly and expensively, and one Chi-Chi was now, unknowingly, about to learn in a far more brutal fashion than I ever had. She quit her event planning business almost entirely during those first months, telling clients she was, quote, focusing on her new home. Though Sunday suspected, and I later confirmed, that Emeka had actually asked her to step back from client work, worried that her connections in the event industry might eventually lead someone to ask uncomfortable questions about the source of his own company's sudden and renewed cash flow. It is worth noting, looking back, how convenient this request actually was in ways Chi-Chi could not have understood at the time. An independent businesswoman with her own steady income and her own professional network might ask sharper questions about the paperwork he later placed before her, might have insisted on her own lawyer reviewing anything with her signature attached. A newly married woman stepping fully into domestic life, dependent on Emeka's version of events for information about their shared finances, was a far easier woman to hand a folder of documents to and receive a signature without resistance. She did not question this request. Why would she? She was newly married to a man Lagos considered a success, living in a house she believed was fully paid for, wearing jewelry Emeka gifted her with increasing, almost frantic frequency, as though each gift were a small down payment on her continued silence and trust. Diamond earrings for their 1-month anniversary, a gold bracelet after an argument Sunday overheard through the study door about spending, a new designer handbag flown in from Paris the same week, coincidentally or not, that the household staff began complaining quietly among themselves about salaries arriving later and later each month. It was Sunday who first mentioned the men.
Not the debt collectors yet, not at first, just men, serious-looking men in suits who came to the house in the evenings and sat with Emeka in his study for hours, their voices low, sometimes raised. Sunday said Oga Emeka started looking thin, that he stopped smiling the way he used to, that he had begun locking his study door even when he stepped out to use the bathroom, something he never used to do. I filed this information away the way you file away gossip about a life you have already left behind. Curious but distant, the way you watch weather happening in a country you no longer live in. What I did not know, what I only pieced together much later from documents from a lawyer, from Chichi herself, in a phone call I never expected to receive, was what was actually happening behind that locked study door. Emeka's logistics company, the empire he had promised me at that wedding in Enugu 11 years earlier, was hollow for a long time, longer than even I had suspected during our marriage. The trucks were leased, not owned. The warehouse in Apapa was rented under a company name that owed 3 years of back payments. The contracts he claimed to have with major manufacturers had in reality dried up 2 years before our divorce, replaced by smaller, riskier jobs that barely covered fuel costs. Emeka had been running the business and by extension our entire lifestyle, the school fees he paid for his sister's children, the cars, the parties, the version of success he performed so convincingly, entirely on borrowed money. He had loans from 3 different banks, each one taken out to cover the interest on the last, a cycle that had been quietly spinning for nearly 3 years before I even discovered the affair. He had a personal loan from a cooperative society in Onitsha that he had not touched in 14 months, the monthly deductions from his supposed salary account having stopped entirely, a fact the cooperative's officers apparently raised with him repeatedly through letters he never showed anyone. And, most dangerously, he had 2 private lenders, men who did not send polite letters when payments were missed, men whose names Sunday only ever heard whispered, never spoken plainly, the kind of lenders businessmen in Lagos turn to only when banks have already said no and pride will not allow them to admit defeat publicly. I later learned through Barrister Adaeze that Emeka had actually approached 2 different banks for fresh loans in the year before our divorce, both of which declined his applications after reviewing his company's declining revenue and existing debt obligations. It was only after those rejections, humiliating for a man who had built his entire identity around the appearance of effortless success, that he turned to the private lending circuit, where approval came faster and with far fewer questions asked, but at interest rates that made the debt multiply with terrifying speed. By the time Chichi married Emeka, Emeka was not a wealthy man hiding a mistress. He was a drowning man who, whether by accident or by design, had found someone new to hold on to as the water rose. Someone whose name was clean, whose credit history was untouched, whose trust in him was still fresh enough to sign whatever he placed in front of her. Here is where the story turns, and I want you to pay close attention because this is the part that even I did not understand until months after it happened. When Emeka married Chichi, Nigerian banking regulations required updated documentation for several of his outstanding credit facilities since his marital status had changed and his previous loan applications listed me, his wife at the time, as a guarantor and joint account holder on 2 significant lines of credit tied to the business. When we divorced, that guarantor status should have been formally removed and replaced. It's a process that takes paperwork, bank visits, signatures, verification. It is tedious. It is exactly the kind of tedious administrative task a busy, desperate, drowning man might choose to handle quickly rather than carefully. Emeka did not remove my name properly. Instead, according to what the lawyer later explained to me, he used the divorce proceedings themselves and Chichi's eagerness to fully step into the role of Mrs. Chukwu Emeka to quietly substitute one name for another on documents Chichi barely read before signing.
Barrister Adaeze explained it to me this way, sitting across his desk with a patience I did not expect from a man who had once represented my ex-husband against me. He said that in ordinary circumstances, when a guarantor is removed from a loan facility, the lending institution requires either a replacement guarantor of comparable financial standing or full repayment of the outstanding balance before release. Most divorced men in Emeka's position, drowning in the kind of debt he carried, would have struggled to find any bank willing to release a guarantor without a suitable replacement, because from the lender's perspective, the loan itself had become significantly riskier,
the moment the marriage collapsed. What Emeka needed, desperately and immediately, was someone new to step into that exact role. Someone with a clean financial history, a fresh bank verification number, untouched by any prior default, someone who trusted him enough not to ask hard questions about paperwork presented as routine formality. Chichi, newly married and eager to prove herself the perfect wife, was, Barrister Adaeze said quietly, exactly what a man in Emeka's position needed. Whether he had planned it with cold calculation from the very beginning, or simply recognized in the chaos of his unraveling finances a convenient solution standing right in front of him, wearing a wedding ring he had just placed on her finger. She trusted him. She was newly married, deeply in love, or at least deeply invested in the image of the life she believed she had won, and when he brought her paperwork to sign, telling her it was simply formalities to transfer the household accounts and property into her name as the new Mrs. Unchuku Emeka, she signed everything he placed in front of her. She did not know, could not have known, unless she had read every line with a lawyer's eye, that buried within those documents were fresh personal guarantees, her bank verification number neatly typed into fields that should have remained blank or should have listed a company entity instead of an individual. Her signature, once given, made her personally and legally liable for the full repayment of both loans should the primary borrower default. The primary borrower, of course, was Emeka's already struggling logistics company, a company that, unknown to Chichi, had been steadily defaulting on smaller obligations for over a year before she ever signed anything. What makes this particular kind of betrayal so difficult for me to fully condemn, even now, even knowing everything I know, is that I understand exactly how it happens. I signed similar documents myself years earlier in the early trusting seasons of my own marriage, when Emeka would slide papers across the dining table during dinner and say, "Sign here for me, Ada, it's just the usual thing." And I signed without reading, because reading felt like an insult to a marriage that was supposed to run on trust rather than suspicion. The only difference between Chichi's fate and mine was timing. My name came off the paperwork during the divorce, cleanly, formally, notarized and confirmed. Hers went on, freshly and quietly in the exact same window of vulnerability, the early trusting months of a new marriage, when a woman is least likely to question the man she has just promised her life to. I need you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly had to. The woman who took my husband did not simply inherit my house and my title. She inherited my risk, my exposure, my name on paper standing behind millions of naira in loans that were never hers to begin with. And she did it without knowing, smiling in wedding photos while unknowingly signing her own financial destruction into existence. Before I continue, let me pause here for a moment, because I know some of you are already trying to guess what happens next, already forming theories in the comment section about who deserves what in this story. I want to tell you honestly, this is not a simple story of a villain getting what she deserves. It is more complicated than that, and more painful. And by the end, I suspect some of you will feel differently about Chichi than you do right now, listening to how she arrived in that mansion. If you are enjoying this story so far, make sure you are subscribed, because the next part, the part where everything comes crashing down, is the part everybody who has heard this story tells me they did not see coming, even when they thought they had it all figured out. For a while, Emeka managed to keep the water from rising past the door frame. He sold a piece of land he owned outside Lagos, quietly, without telling Chichi the real reason, and used it to service the private lender's interest payments for a few more months. He took on new business, riskier business. Moving goods for clients, Sunday admitted, made him uneasy. Men who paid in cash and never left names. Vehicles arriving at odd hours of the night to load unmarked crates that Sunday was instructed never to inspect or ask questions about. Sunday told me he began to suspect, though he could never confirm it, that some of these new clients were not entirely legitimate businessmen, that the desperation in Emeka's final months had pushed him towards arrangements a more stable version of himself would never have entertained. But death does not wait forever, and desperation is not a strategy, it is only a delay.
By the 10th month of Chichi's marriage, the private lenders stopped accepting partial payments. They wanted their principal back in full with the accumulated interest, and they wanted it within 30 days. There was a particular evening one Sunday described to me in unusual detail because it frightened him enough that he still remembered every part of it, when one of the private lenders came to the house himself rather than sending intermediaries. A heavy-set man named Chief Obadina, known in certain Lagos business circles for financing informal loans at interest rates that made bank overdrafts look generous by comparison. Sunday said Chief Obadina did not raise his voice, did not threaten in any way that could be recorded or reported, but simply sat across from Emeka in the study and spoke in a low, measured tone that Sunday found more frightening than shouting would have been. He told Emeka that he had given him 3 extensions already, that his own investors were asking questions he couldn't keep deflecting forever, and that the next visit would not be a conversation. Emeka apparently laughed it off in front of Chief Obadina, promised a large payment within 2 weeks, spoke confidently about a new contract with a manufacturing firm in Aba that would solve everything. Sunday said that after Chief Obadina left, Emeka sat alone in his study until almost 2 in the morning, the desk lamp the only light visible from outside, and that Sunday when he brought him a glass of water unprompted, some old habit of care left over from years of service, Emeka's hands were shaking too badly to hold the glass steadily. Emeka did what men like him always do when the walls close in. He ran. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to and say, that was the moment he fled. It happened slowly, the way water leaves a cracked bucket. First, it was a business trip to Dubai that stretched from 4 days to 2 weeks. Then, a sudden opportunity in South Africa that required him to, quote, handle things personally on the ground. Then, silence. Phone calls that went to voicemail, WhatsApp messages that showed only one great tick, never blew. Chichi, according to what she told me much later, spent almost 3 weeks convincing herself that her husband was simply busy, simply overwhelmed, simply doing what successful men do when business demanded their full attention. It was on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that gives no warning of what it is about to become, that the first men arrived at the gate. Not the 6 in black jackets yet, that would come later, but 2 quieter men in a grey Camry holding folders instead of banging on gates. They asked to speak with Mrs. Chukwuemeka. Chichi came out in her silk robe, still holding her morning tea, confused, mildly annoyed at the interruption, the way you are annoyed by someone selling something you did not ask for. They were not selling anything. They were collecting. The first folder contained a loan agreement for 18 million naira taken from one of the private lenders 8 months earlier, with her BVN listed as the primary guarantor, her signature at the bottom, dated the same week as her wedding anniversary with Emeka. The same week he had brought her, quote, formalities to sign for the household transfer. The second folder was worse. A personal loan of 11 million naira from a different lender, again her BVN, again her signature, this one taken out only 4 months before the men now stood at her gate. Sunday told me later that Chichi did not scream that first day. She stood very still, he said, reading the papers over and over as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying if she looked hard enough. Then she asked to see her husband's business documents, his company registration, anything, and the men in the grey Camry told her, almost gently, that Emeka Chukwuemeka's logistics company had been deregistered for non-payment of statutory fees 11 months ago, and that as far as their records showed, Emeka Chukwuemeka currently had no fixed address, no active phone line reachable within Nigeria, and no known assets remaining in his name. Everything, every loan, every liability, now traced back to her. Chichi spent the rest of that first day on the phone, first with Emeka, whose number rang and rang without answer, then with his younger brother in Onitsha, then with a lawyer friend from her university days who agreed to look at the documents as a favor. That friend, according to what Chichi told me during our phone call months later, was the first person to say out loud the sentence that would define the rest of her year. She said, "Chichi, I need you to understand something. Whether or not you knew what you are signing does not matter to the bank or to these lenders. Your BVN is your BVN. Your signature is your signature. Nigerian law does not ask whether you read the document carefully. It only asks whether the signature at the bottom is yours. Chichi told me she sat with that sentence for a long time, turning it over, searching for a loophole, a technicality, some version of the story where trust was not, in the end, a legally binding liability. There was no such version. The loans were real, the signatures were real, and the man whose company actually benefited from every naira borrowed was, as far as anyone could determine, somewhere between Dubai and Johannesburg, entirely unreachable. I found out about all of this the way most of Lagos eventually found out, through a phone call from Ngozi, who had heard it from someone at her church who apparently knew someone who worked at one of the banks involved. I remember sitting on my small couch in my Yaba flat, listening to Ngozi's voice rising with a mixture of shock and something uncomfortably close to satisfaction. Her words tumbling over each other with the barely contained excitement of someone delivering the juiciest gossip of the year. And I remember feeling nothing like triumph. I thought I would feel triumph. I had imagined in the darker corners of my grief over the divorce, small fantasies of Chichi's happiness crumbling, late-night imaginations I was never proud of but never quite managed to suppress either, especially during the loneliest weeks right after the wedding photos surfaced. I had pictured in those private moments a kind of clean, satisfying justice, the woman who broke my home losing hers in turn, a neat and balanced ending to a story that had felt for so long deeply unfair. But hearing it happen for real, hearing that a woman was about to lose everything for a scheme she never designed and barely understood, I felt something closer to grief. Not for her exactly, not entirely, because the wound she helped create in my own life had not fully healed even by then, but grief for all of us, for what desperation and dishonesty can do to people who trusted the wrong person's version of success, for how easily any of us, no matter how careful, can find ourselves standing at a gate we do not recognize, holding papers with our own name printed beneath promises we never made. The 6 men in black jackets came 3 weeks after that first quiet visit, when it became clear Chichi could not produce the payments, could not produce Emeka, could not produce anything except increasingly frantic phone calls to a number that no longer existed. They did not knock, they banged, exactly as I told you at the beginning of this story, and Chichi stood on that balcony, my old balcony, screaming that there had been a mistake, that this was her husband's business and not hers. But the papers did not care what she believed. The papers only cared what she signed. Sunday, who witnessed most of that morning from his post near the gate, told me later that an older one with grey at his temples spoke to Chichi almost kindly, the way you might speak to someone about to receive bad news from a doctor. Madam, we understand this is difficult, but the law does not recognize what you believed, only what you signed. Chichi apparently laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind of laugh that comes out when your mind refuses to process what your ears just heard. She told them to leave, that she would call her lawyer, that this was clearly some kind of scam targeting successful families in Lekki. She had read about such schemes online. The men did not argue with her. They simply left one folder with her at the gate, a courtesy they called it, and told her she had 14 days to respond before the matter proceeded to the next stage. Sunday said Chichi stood at that gate for almost 20 minutes after the grey Camry pulled away, staring down at the folder in her hands, not moving, not speaking, the tea in her cup gone cold beside her on the low wall. By the time the 6 men in black jackets came 3 weeks later, Chichi was no longer the confident woman who had once corrected caterers and redecorated marble staircases. Sunday said she had lost weight, that she had stopped hosting anyone, that the new cook she had hired had also quietly left unpaid for 3 weeks running. When the men banged on that gate, she came out already knowing on some level what they wanted, but some stubborn human part of her still needed to fight it, still needed to stand on that balcony and insist that a mistake had been made, that she was Mrs. Chukwuemeka, that surely her husband's name, his company, his signature should be the ones on those papers, not hers. One of the men, the same grey-templed one from the earlier visit, looked up at her from the compound below,
and said the words Sunday repeated to me almost as exactly as he heard them, because they stayed with him too. Madam, your husband's name is nowhere on these documents, only yours. We have checked everywhere. There is no Emeka and Chukwemeka left to collect from. There is only you. Quick reminder before we go further, because I know some of you are watching this at night, getting ready for bed, and I do not want you falling asleep before you hear how this actually ends. Subscribe now if you have not already, and let's finish this together. What happened over the following months, I learned mostly through Barrister Adaeze, the same lawyer who had once represented Emeka in our divorce, and who, in a twist that still makes me shake my head, was approached by Chichi herself, seeking representation against the very man he once worked for. He told me, over a cup of tea in his office when I came to sign an affidavit confirming that my own name had indeed been removed from all guarantor agreements prior to the dates in question, that Chichi's case was one of the more painful ones he had handled in years. The Lekki mansion was seized within 4 months, sold at a fraction of its value to satisfy the smaller of the 2 private loans. The Lexus I once drove, which Emeka had gifted to Chichi as a wedding present barely 6 weeks after our divorce, was repossessed and auctioned, the tow truck arriving early one Saturday morning, while Chichi, according to Sunday, stood in the driveway in her nightgown, begging the men to wait until she could call someone, anyone who might help her make sense of what was happening to her life in real time. Chichi's own event planning business, the one she had built before the marriage, the one that had given her genuine independence and genuine skill, collapsed under the weight of her damaged credit history and the public embarrassment that spread across Lagos social circles faster than any of us could have imagined. Clients quietly stopped calling. Vendors who once extended her generous payment terms began demanding cash upfront if they agreed to work with her at all. A woman I knew from church, who had once hired Chichi to plan her daughter's 16th birthday party, told me she cancelled a booking for her son's graduation reception the moment the story broke, not because she believed Chichi had done anything wrong exactly, but because Lagos society runs on appearances, and nobody wanted their celebration associated, even indirectly, with a name currently trending across 3 different lifestyle blogs and half a dozen gossip pages, under headlines with words like scandal and downfall and karma. The furniture went next, then the jewelry Emeka had gifted her with such frantic frequency during those early trusting months, most of it seized and auctioned to satisfy portions of the second loan. Chichi moved out of the mansion entirely 6 weeks before it was formally sold, into a single room in a family friend's house in Ogba, a part of Lagos so far removed from Lekki's glass towers and gated estates that Sunday said she barely recognized her own reflection anymore, not because her face had changed, but because everything around it had. The staff scattered. Mama Rose had already left months earlier over unpaid wages, but the new cook, the driver, even Sunday himself eventually had to seek new employment when the mansion's new owners brought their own household staff. Sunday found work in a family in Ikeja, a modest household that he told me with a small, tired laugh reminded him more of my own early years with Emeka than anything from the mansion's final chaotic months. Emeka, as far as anyone in Lagos could determine, was living somewhere in Johannesburg, under circumstances nobody could confirm. Barrister Adaeze told me that attempts to serve him with legal documents through international channels had been, in his words, extraordinarily difficult, the kind of difficult that suggests deliberate effort on the other end rather than simple bad luck. Whether he had planned the entire collapse from the beginning, engineering his exit while leaving Chichi to inherit the wreckage, or whether he had simply been a desperate man who made increasingly reckless choices as the walls closed in, I genuinely do not know, and honestly, at some point, I stopped needing to know. The outcome was the same either way. A woman who thought she had won a life ended up owing for a life that was never real to begin with. I want to tell you something that surprised even me. 6 months after the men in black jackets came to that gate, Chichi called me.
I almost did not pick up. Her number still saved from the one time we had exchanged contact at that christening in Ikoyi years earlier, a lifetime it felt like, but something made me answer. Maybe curiosity, maybe something softer than curiosity that I am still not fully able to name. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for anything really. She said she had gotten my number from a mutual acquaintance and that she needed to say something to me directly, woman to woman, without an audience. Her voice was different from the confident, room-straightening voice I remembered at that christening in Ikoyi. Years ago, it felt like. It was smaller, tired. We talked for almost 40 minutes that day, longer than I expected, longer than I think either of us intended. She told me about the morning the grey Camry first arrived, how she had genuinely believed for the first several days that it was some elaborate scam, because the alternative, that her own husband had engineered her financial ruin, using her trust as the very instrument of its execution, felt too monstrous to accept all at once. She told me about calling Emeka's family in Onitsha, hoping they might know where he had gone, only to discover that his own mother had not heard from him in over 3 months either, and that his younger brother, in a moment of unexpected honesty, admitted that Emeka had once done something similar, on a much smaller scale, to a business partner years before he and I had ever met, a story I had never once heard during our entire 11 years of marriage. She told me she was sorry, plainly, without excuses, for the pain she had caused when she was younger and hungrier for a life that looked like mine, without understanding what actually held that life together. I asked her gently whether she had known about the affair timeline, whether she had known how long it had actually gone on before I found out. She admitted it was closer to 8 months than the 4 Emeka had originally told me, and that she had known even then that he was still legally married when things between them began. I won't pretend that admission didn't sting freshly, even months removed from the worst of my grief, but I also heard underneath her confession a woman who had already been sentenced by every mirror and every empty bank notification in her life, and I did not feel the need to sentence her further myself.
She told me she had since learned, in the most brutal way a person can learn anything, that a house built on someone else's debt is not a house at all. It is only a very convincing tent, and the storm always finds it eventually. I did not forgive her that day. I am not sure forgiveness works that fast or that neatly, no matter what the films tell you. But I told her I was sorry too, for whatever that was worth. Sorry that a man's cowardice had cost her so much. Sorry that the version of success we had both, in our different ways, been chasing had turned out to be exactly as hollow as it always secretly was. As for me, I want you to know that this story does not end with me draped in triumph either, because that would be its own kind of lie, and I promised myself when I started telling people what happened to me that I would tell it honestly. I rebuilt slowly, and slowly is the important word there, because nothing about starting over happened as quickly or as cleanly as I wished it would. The first year in Yaba was hard in ways I had not expected. Having grown used to a certain rhythm of life, I did not realize I had come to depend on until it was gone. I remember the first time I had to calculate whether I could afford both transport fare and lunch on the same day, doing math I had not needed to do since my university years, and feeling a strange, humbling mixture of shame and clarity. Shame at how far I had fallen from the Lekki mansion, clarity at how much of that mansion had never truly been mine to lose in the first place. My sister, Amaka, let me stay in her spare room for the first 4 months without ever making me feel like a burden. Cooking together in her small kitchen in the evenings, the two of us laughing over shared memories from our childhood in Enugu in a way I had not laughed freely in years. It was during those evenings, actually, chopping onions and stirring pots of stew for Amaka's neighbors who paid us small amounts for home-cooked meals, that the idea for the catering business first took shape. What started as informal cooking for neighbors slowly grew into requests for small birthday parties, then christenings, then eventually full wedding receptions booked months in advance. I used the modest divorce settlement, the money my instincts told me to take quietly instead of fighting for the house, to start a small catering business out of my sister's kitchen in Yaba. cooking for christenings and birthday parties for people who paid on time and looked me in the eye when they spoke to me. It is not a mansion in Lekki. There are no chandeliers, no marble staircases, no drivers waiting outside gates. Some mornings, I still catch myself missing small, specific things about that old life. The particular quality of morning light through the mansion's tall windows, the sound of Sunday's cheerful greeting at the gate, even the absurd comfort of never once in 11 years having to think about how much a bag of rice cost. But every single thing I own today, I own outright, with my own name on it and nobody else's debt hiding underneath the paperwork. And I have come to understand that this particular kind of ownership, small and unglamorous as it looks from the outside, is worth more to me now than any chandelier ever was. My catering business now employs 3 young women from the neighborhood, girls I pay on time every time, because I remember too clearly what it felt like to work for people who did not. We recently catered a wedding reception in Ikeja for a young couple, just starting out, much the way Emeka and I once did, and watching the bride's face during her first dance, I found myself hoping, quietly, that her own foundation was built on something sturdier than the one mine had been. Sometimes I think about that morning on the balcony, Chichi screaming at men who would not listen, and I think about how close I came to being her if the divorce had gone differently, if Emeka had been slightly less careless with his timing, if the guarantor document had never been updated at all. The line between the woman who escaped and the woman who inherited the wreckage was thinner than either of us wanted to believe, and it had almost nothing to do with who deserved what, and everything to do with a signature on a page neither of us had read carefully enough. I heard through Negozi that Chichi eventually moved back to her family's house in Owerri, taking a job as an administrative assistant at a small logistics firm. A modest, ordinary job with a modest, ordinary salary, the kind of job that would have seemed unthinkable to the version of her that once redecorated a Lekki mansion with imported Italian furniture. I do not know whether she has fully rebuilt her life the way I have slowly rebuilt mine. I do not know whether the debt has been fully repaid or whether it still hangs over her, following her credit history the way certain mistakes follow us long after we believe we have moved past them. Barrister Adaeze mentioned once in passing that these things can take years to fully resolve, that the private lenders in particular are rarely interested in payment plans or patience, and that Chichi's road back to financial stability would likely be a long and difficult one. As for Emeka, Lagos being a small, gossip-hungry city it is, occasional rumors reach me even now. Someone claims to have seen him in Johannesburg working under a different surname for a shipping company. Someone else insists he resurfaced briefly in Dubai before disappearing again. I do not know which, if any, of these rumors are true, and honestly, I have stopped needing to know. A man who could do what he did to 2 different women who each in their own season trusted him completely is not a man whose address matters to my healing anymore. What matters is that both Chichi and I eventually learned, in our different painful ways, the true cost of a life built entirely on someone else's word. If this story taught you anything tonight, let it be this. The life someone shows you is never proof of the life they actually have. A mansion can sit on top of debt the way a smile can sit on top of despair. And from the outside, you will never be able to tell the difference until the men in black jackets are standing at the gate. Ask questions, even the uncomfortable ones, even the ones that feel like an insult to a trust you have already given freely. Read what you sign, every page, every clause, no matter how thick the folder or how much you love the hand that placed it in front of you, and never, ever assume that winning someone else's husband means you have won anything at all. Because sometimes what you are really winning is a debt with somebody else's name quietly erased and yours written in its place. A debt that will follow you long after the wedding photos have stopped trending and the guests have gone home. I think too about what this story means beyond Chichi and Emeka and me. Because I've heard versions of it before in different forms from different women, in church basements and hair salons and quiet phone calls late at night. A woman discovers years into a marriage that her name sits quietly on a loan she never remembers agreeing to. A man discovers his signature on a business partnership he barely recalls discussing. Trust in the wrong hands becomes paperwork. And paperwork, unlike promises, does not soften with love or forgiveness. It simply waits patiently until someone comes looking to collect. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through this one. Stories like this take a lot out of me to tell honestly, without exaggeration, without turning real pain into cheap drama, because the people in it, even the ones who hurt me, were real people making real choices under real pressure. And I think that complexity deserves more respect than a simple villain and victim retelling would give it. I still see Sunday sometimes when I visit that side of Lekki for catering deliveries, and he always asks after me with the same warmth he showed when I was still madam of that mansion. A kindness that reminds me some things, some people remain steady even when everything around them changes completely. I do not know what became of the mansion itself, who lives behind those gates now, whether they know anything at all about the two women whose lives quietly unraveled within those marble walls before they ever moved in. What I do know is this. Every naira I earn now, cooking jollof rice and small chops for stranger celebrations in Yaba, feels more solid in my hands than every naira Emeka ever spent on me during our 11 years together, because I know exactly where it came from and I know it belongs fully and only to me. If it moved you, hit subscribe because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the quiet ways people survive the collapse of the lives they thought were permanent. And if you know someone who needs to hear that living with your dignity intact is sometimes the richest thing you can walk away with, send this their way. I will see you in the next one.